So thank you to the organizers for everything that you've put together for this meeting. It's been fascinating. In fact, several things that I've learned are going to have a pretty profound change on some of the work that we do in my lab. I wanted to just say a couple words about where I come from. So I'm part of the biocomplexity, or my lab, the Social and Decision Analytics Laboratory, is part of the Biocomplexity Institute at Virginia Tech. And the Biocomplexity Institute is really a problem-solving enterprise. My director likes to talk about how we work OPPs. That's other people's problems. So we really try to drive our research through the lens of real problems that people are facing, particularly in the policy and public good domain. And so I'm going to share some of that with you today. So I'm going to, first of all, because part of this session is about models and frameworks and standards, I want to give you a little bit of a sense of how we approach what I like to call the science of all data. We've been trying to change the rubric away from big data because we just get into endless discussions on what is big. High dimensions, what is high? In some cases, 3 dimensions is pretty high. So I want to share with you how we're trying to put some structure and frameworks and standards behind how we're trying to wrestle with all this data that's out there today. And then I do want to talk about how you might go about using some non-traditional data sources to measure innovation, and very specifically intangibles, the sort of elusive piece of assets that can really drive our economies. And then I'll give you a couple of examples, both of how these alternative data sources, and I'll talk a lot about administrative data today, how they can be used to actually develop innovation within an organization, and how they could possibly be used to measure innovation. And then some concluding thoughts. So the science of all data. I think that you're all aware, and we've heard examples of this today, that there's data all around us. It's been around us for a long time. But I like to think about the fact that historically we've tended to use these different data streams in silos. We've spent a lot of time modeling infrastructure, transportation, roads, air, all of these sorts of things. We've spent a lot of time over the years modeling the environment, and there's just been a ton of information for decades, more than a century of trying to model and collect data on people. But today, we can actually now try to bring all of these things together across these silos of data, and I think we've seen a lot of talks, particularly the last talk right before lunch, Cesar's talk on how it's time to start bringing the data from all these silos together and let it interact and tell stories. But if we're going to do that, I think it's really important to be cognizant of what the data are, how the data are born, and to recognize that there's a lot of nuances that are different depending on what type of data you're trying to bring together to either just explore or to model or to build predictive inferences about. And these are the buckets that we like to put the data into when we're using it, and we have found it really useful when we work with people to try to focus them on what bucket their data might be coming from, because it does present different problems around how we assess bias, representativeness, how we determine how we're going to be integrating this data across different levels of support and things like that. So most of science over years and years and years has been based on design data collection. Surveys, experiments, intentional collection of data. But today we all know that a lot of attention has been paid to administrative data, and we saw many examples of that. If we're looking at the patent database, that's administrative data that you're pulling together. So there's administrative data sources that are very powerful. Opportunity data, everything that you can scrape off the web through social media and all of these sorts of things, it's another bucket, and it has its own set of issues, both in the collection of it and in the use of it. And then a bucket that we added to this list just a while back is procedural data. A procedural piece of data could be the algorithm that runs the stoplight, or it could be an actual procedure that governs some activity within an organization or within a community. And it's really important to, first of all, be able to use that kind of data and use that as data. And secondly, to understand what implications procedures have on the data streams that you're looking at. In our lab, we've developed a basic research model. A lot of the goal in our laboratory is to actually develop what we call a data framework a really disciplined approach to be using all of these different data sources to support different problems. And our lab is not very old, we're 4 years young. And when we started and were asked the question, what kind of a framework should you use to start to manage and handle all these different data sources and as you build them towards statistical models? The only way that we knew to answer that question was to roll our sleeves up and to start to work problems, to start to work case studies with the hope that as we go through this process a few times, synergies will fall out in terms of what the formalization is for a framework for using these different data sources. Now, another thing that I think is really important is that if you're using all of this data that's around you, you really should use it and let it drive towards what data gaps you need to fill. Let it help define what data collection you should now initiate, as opposed to doing data collection that simply replicates what you already have, because data collection is very expensive. So that's our basic model. Now, the data framework that has started to fall out of all of this, and this is through working problems with industry, working problems with local jurisdictions, working problems with nonprofits, working problems with state government, working problems with federal government, is this particular picture. And when you see it, you might go, well, of course. But it came about through multiple problem sets, multiple different problems, different domains, and we were sort of surprised because we kept drawing the same picture. So now this is what we're trying to formalize. And what's really important is at the top, there is a problem that you're trying to study, a research question. That is really important because we feel that we should be driving our use of data through questions that we want to answer. Now with that, if you're willing to be courageous, once you have your question, if you take your blinders off and allow yourself to think about any possible data that might be brought to bear on this question. Don't be bothered with if you can get it. If it's available, don't be bothered initially if there's privacy issues. Just think about if you had anything, if you were allowed to have anything at all to solve this problem, what data would you want to bring together? That's a data discovery process. And then you can move from that into actually starting to inventory all these lists of data that you've written down, try to figure out whether they are available, what it takes to acquire them. Once you make some decisions there, you need to go through that really time-consuming step of profiling your data, cleaning it up, getting it ready for analysis. As Hadley Wickham likes to remind us, that's where you're going to spend 80% of your time. And then you move forward into your analyses, and in always doing some pretty rigorous evaluations of the fitness of use of the data for the problem at the top that you started out to solve. So that's the basic structure of the framework that has been evolving in our work, and I'll give you a pretty concrete example of this a little later on, of putting it into use. Okay, so that's my part of the presentation about thinking about frameworks and standards and ways to standardize what we're doing in this all data space. And now I'd like to focus you on a particular application. And this has to do with measuring innovation. And so let me just take you through this a little bit. And interestingly, this is the second time that Joseph has appeared today. Well, and my quote from him is a little bit earlier than Scott's was. In 1934, he talked about innovation, and he talked very specifically about intangibles, how they are new products, processes or methods of production, a new market or sources of supply, a new form of commercial businesses or financial organizations. So these are these things that we call intangibles. And a question is, what are they really? Well, if you are going to take an accounting approach, what you would choose to look at for intangibles would be patents, copyrights, trademarks, trade secrets, R&D, computer software code. And during the last day and a half, we've seen people actually access these kinds of data sources and measure them in a variety of different ways. Well, there's also another type of intangible, and that's the one that you can't really identify. That's goodwill. If one business acquires another and they actually pay more than book value, then there's some goodwill there that they've just acquired. Human capital. In the last few talks and just in what do we do with these high school kids, That's human capital that feeds into all of this enterprise and into our economy as an intangible. We have processes, databases, software use, and organizational competencies, and then knowledge and technical capabilities within a firm, and collaborations. All of these are intangibles. And this is what I'm going to argue we should try to be measuring more effectively. Well, how do they play into anything? And this is a little cartoon that I put together. If you think about the creation of new and improved products and services and in different processes, if you think of innovative capital, intellectual property, economic competence, human capital, those outputs are a result of tangible inputs and intangible inputs that takes themselves through a set of innovative activities, our ideas that then go through R&D, design, and prototyping. And I would argue that in every one of your research groups, every one of your organizations, you do this as well. This is not just something companies do. This is a process that we all do in our work. And so these intangibles really do play an important role in the creation of new things. Well, they enable knowledge to be commercialized or used. And it's really important to think about what happens if we fail to measure them. And if we fail to measure them, we're going to miss important changes in the economy. Productivity, resources, financial statements will not be accurate. Sometimes people do care about that. And we'll also miss non-business contributions to the economy through the use and production of intangible outputs, such as some of the things that I have up here. These innovations that are brought by primarily large companies to maintain their market position, education, really important. And now another type of software, open source software. How many of you have created open source software? Yeah. Where does that get counted in the value of our economy? Well, this is all important because if you miss these things, you're really missing accounting for some valuable things in our economy. And here's just an example that the Amazon market value is about 23% its book value. Well, what makes up that difference? That difference is because the intangibles are not included in the book value. So that would be sort of considered an example of goodwill if you were to buy Amazon at its market value. Okay, so why is it hard to measure these things? And it's hard to measure these things because they're largely invisible from an accounting standpoint. And there's not a lot of direct ways to put your hands on them. And there is a lot of work that's gone on, at least in the last decade, over trying to measure these. And a lot of what's done is through estimation approaches that rely on pretty sound assumptions from economics. But those have some issues associated with them. And it really amounts to that if you think that this intangible is already captured in a national account, in the national accounting, then what happens is that there are different approaches under different assumptions to just move it from one side of the equation to the other. Now, I should comment that my lab is a collection, intentionally, of statisticians and social and behavioral scientists. And on the team that's working on this particular problem, I'm the statistician, and I'm embedded in my economist. So they would probably say this a little differently. But anyway, but to me, when I hear my colleagues talk about this, it's really about moving this piece of data from one side of the equation to the other. It's done in different ways in different countries, and there's a lot of talk about how this affects the GDP. And we can remember when R&D was all of a sudden moved to an asset as opposed to an outcome in the measure of GDP, it had a huge impact on the value of GDP. Okay, so this brings me to pointing out that we think it's pretty important to try to measure these. That even measuring them badly might be better than not measuring them at all, because this gap in not having them is growing. So the question that we have is, can we leverage the science of all data in some way to create innovation and also to develop defensible and repeatable measures of intangibles. And I should have possibly said earlier on that a lot of what goes on right now with the national accounts and the way one tries to get at these measures is largely through surveys and survey studies. So now the argument is, can we move away from design data collection and possibly get at this in a different way? So the first example that I want to share with you is one that actually relates to both using massive amounts of administrative data, transactional data, to create innovation within a company. And I don't have the answer about how I would know about that if I was trying to measure that from the outside. So that maybe is step 2 down the road. But that's going to be the first thing, is just to show you how these data sources can actually be created, can be used to create some pretty significant innovation within an organization. And I should also say that I think almost exactly at this moment, my junior colleagues who led this work are presenting this work at the Winter Simulation Conference. So there again, it's too bad they're not presenting it to you. So here's the problem. The problem and the question that came to us was, would it be possible to make use of the massive amounts of transactional data that lives within silos of a large consumer goods organization? It's Procter & Gamble. Would it be possible to somehow use that data and link it together in such a way that it could give you some insight into what's going on across the supply chain, and possibly also be used to synchronize that supply chain, and to do it in such a way that it could be related right back to total shareholder return and profitability of the organization? And I should say that typically how one might think about modeling an end-to-end supply chain and synchronizing it would be to follow individual SKUs, products through that chain, the materials that go with it, kind of SKU by SKU, which doesn't really allow you to get at certain dynamics that we know exist in supply chains. And if you ask yourself, why are there dynamics in the supply chain? Well, it's because there are people in the supply chain actually doing the work, not just machines, and making decisions along the way. So they introduce a lot of dynamics into the chain. So the chart on the top is sort of a simplistic view of a supply chain. But then what I'm doing is that I'm linking with the dotted lines, either modeling the links. If it's a solid line, it's a direct link of transactional data, orders, deliveries, different shipments, different things like this that occur in the chain, these transactional pieces of data. Down below are just a piece of the massive amount of reports and spreadsheet type data that exists for these transactional data pieces. And we needed to sort of backward engineer out what those data are to try to develop the links between these different sources. Let's just take a zoom in on one piece. So as we started to look at this, we thought, well, let's just see if we can do some visualization to see if we understand what this data flow is and if we got the linking right. So here we're actually linking from, if I come back, from orders to delivering shipment data. I'm just linking those two pieces of data, seeing if I can do that. And it was pretty cool. So we were able to get this picture that went through to try to understand how this data was flowing from orders to shipments. However, we noticed something right here. How can this be? Stuff comes in and more comes out. And this is where we learned in the data that when they were looking at their shipments, they were doing nets. So it was positive. If it went out, it was negative, it came back as a return. That all of a sudden there were all this return data that was occurring in here. So this visualization of the data just allowed us to actually realize that there were some pieces of information in the data that we didn't fully understand. And then we could figure that out and resolve it. So the next thing we did is we took all of these different data, the orders, the specific line production dynamics, raw materials, current inventories, shipments, all of this type of transactional data, and we built 4 integrated simulators. And there you see them there. So it looks pretty simple, but each one of them is very complicated in their own right, and then they had to be linked together. And by doing this, so we have orders, production planner, shipment simulator, and production simulator. So for the orders, for example, was sort of a linear Bayesian model where we were actually able to use the real data to update the Bayesian model to really get a feel for what the orders were looking like that would be coming in. So that was going to form the basis of the orders. And then we were able to look at the actual production. And here we did a Bayesian hierarchical model that took into account things like seasonality, day of week, time of day. It took into account what was going on specific lines, but in a very dynamic way. And it also was looking at all of the skews at the same time, so you now get dynamics across what's going on with the skews. You've got 3 different examples there. And then we were also able to look at the production planner and looking at what is the inventory that they have on hand. We were able to incorporate a lot of different scheduled rules, and in this particular picture what you see is that your blue is your inventory, and your inventory starts to drop. All of a sudden there's a red dot, and you do a production, and your inventory shoots back up, and then it starts to drop again as there's orders. So there's this dynamic pattern that occurs here. And so we were able to link together this with our production simulator that could actually bring in the stochastic realizations of the runtimes for producing all of these different skews. So now we have all this dynamic stuff going on. Oh, I should say then the shipment, we kept that with just a discrete event simulation model, as that's usually handled. Link that in. And then once you have all of this, go right by that one. Once you have all of this, you're actually able to now use this model to test out different decisions that you could be making across the space and look at what effect that has on profit and on-time delivery, which are the 2 metrics that drive total shareholder return for this company, and actually get a response surface out. Now, what was so amazing to me about this problem is that if you think about it, this is transactional data. This is not typical material flow data. Across the company, across the silos of the data, the fact that we came anywhere close to capturing what's going on end-to-end of the supply chain was pretty amazing. And the fact that we actually ended up with a model that they can now use to be making decisions about the synchronization of the chain was pretty amazing. So that just shows you the power of administrative data. Now let me go on to a different example quickly here. And this is measuring open source software. Why do we care about this? Well, we care about this because it's used across fields. It helps support research. Innovation is created outside the business sector. That's where this is created, and we'd really like to understand that. So the big question here is, can the scope and impact of this be measured using publicly available data? Why is that important? Currently, if you look at the software that's measured, it's billions and billions of dollars. If you now included open source software, it would be probably many billions more. So that's something that we should care about capturing. All right, so what did we do? Research question is up there. We want to measure the scope and impact. So the first thing was the data discovery process. So we first thought about what are the dimensions of the data that we would be looking for to measure open source software. So we would want stock measures, flow measures, categories. Those are the different types of software, if you will, sectors, private, public. And then also who uses it, attribution. So once we did that, we found about 6 sources of data that we thought would be very useful to explore. We took these 6 sources, we went through a data inventory and an acquisition process to try to figure out which ones we might actually be able to gain some access to. And we chose 3 different ones that have very different properties to them. Black Duck is a collection of where people actually build open source software, and there's a lot of information there. SourceForce is a repository of all kinds of features about open source software across the wide span of software. And then DEPSI was an NSF-funded project that gathered tons of statistics on Python and R open source softwares. So we wanted to see what we could find among these. So the next thing, again with the research question in mind, we went through the process of data profiling, cleaning, and linking and exploring the data. And in particular, we now translated those data dimensions into variables that we would like to measure, things like downloads, lines of code, man hours, etc. And we asked the question for each of these data sources, can we find these variables in those data sources? So that's sort of the first step. Well, in fact, we could. So just a few quick examples. Here's some different pieces of software that were in Black Duck. And it's kind of interesting to see the difference in man hours depending on the software. You can kind of tell some people like some software more than others, and maybe they're going to work on it and actually commit their materials to it. Then when we looked at SourceForge, that was really interesting first to look at the coverage of software that they had. So you see this is just the different topics that they're covering in their software. And lots of effort goes into development. And then here's just a quick chart of the different categories that people care about when they're looking at measuring software production. Systems administration all the way to audio, video. And so we looked at the number of projects that they had and the number of downloads per project. Now, DEPSI is the really interesting source here. And again, so this is a collection of R and Python codes and all kinds of statistics, including citations out in the literature and in other places where they could find use of these codes, all different sorts of measures on it. So this seemed really promising. So what we did is, and I should also say that, so we were looking at the R packages, and from their APIs that we could pull data out, we were actually able to generate the full network of all the R codes, which was about 7,800 nodes, 20,000 directed edges. But then we zoomed in on just a piece of that where we used the modern applied statistics with S as the parent node, and it had 149 subnodes. And so we looked at, okay, what's the data that we can pull from this? And here you see things like authorship credit to the different authors, but the variables were impact factor, citations, time used, contributions, downloads, the number of commits. We could also do different network analysis on the dependencies and the neighborhood size. And I'm just going to show a couple results here. So the first is about impact and downloads, the relationship there. And the size of the dot is the number of downloads, the intensity is the impact. And it was pretty surprising that there was a lot of distribution here in terms of even small amount of downloads had significant impacts across this network. The second one is impact and number of contributors. And again, you find some relationships that aren't completely intuitive on this. And some of the other colleagues on the team who do a lot of network work have done some network analysis on this to try to pull out, again, we're trying to pull out data, we're trying to pull out measurable things that we could use to measure the impact and cost of the open source software. Okay, so then the question is, what's next? Well, what's next is to try to build some accurate and repeatable models to predict costs to produce open source software. This particular research is collaborative with the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics, which is the statistical agency that sits within NSF. And that's the agency that does a lot of the science indicator reporting, the STEM education reporting, R&D reporting, innovation reporting. And so if they're ever going to use any of this in their indices, in their national indices, it has to be something that's repeatable over time and defensible. And so in this case, the next step was to think about what kind of a model would you want to build or would you try to build. And so the first thing that we've done is to look at what are the common attributes in other software development models. When they measure software within companies, what are some of these attributes? And there they are there. And the question becomes, on the fitness for use side of our particular framework, is now we're going back and evaluating the data that we have and the quality of that data to actually be able to be used in a cost estimation model, such as what is done for other pieces of software. And that's sort of where that project is. And then finally, let me just conclude with trying to motivate you to think about the fact that we can try to measure things that have been elusive to us in the past if we try to use this world of data that we're in right now, but only if we can use it in a pretty disciplined and structured way. Because if we're going to try to measure these things, whether it's about the economy or trying to measure things that's going to be fed into what we now call evidence-based policy, program evaluation, all of these sorts of things, it has to be something that we can repeat and defend. And so that's where thinking about what the framework is that you're trying to work within is extremely important. And my last statement is that this is hard work, but we really do believe it's possible and worth doing. So with that, thank you.